glad you guys are here today. So we will continue on and hopefully some people will join us. But remember, we are talking about Zhuangzi this week, right? So we are finishing up our second section on Daoism. So just like when we looked at Confucianism, we looked at the originating figure, right, Kongzi, and then one of his most influential disciples, Shunzi. We're doing the same thing with Daoism, right? We looked at Lao Tzu, and now we're looking at Zhuangzi, his most influential disciple. We're also going to look at another one of Kongzi's disciples next week, as I mentioned, Mengzi, but he is definitely going to be more related to that Neo-Confucian movement, which incorporates a lot of Daoist stuff that we've been talking about this week, right? So that's why we have to wait to get to him. Right, but again, it's important to understand the influence, the long-lasting influence that these traditions have had, both on different cultural and religious practices around the world, also politically, right, as we've seen, especially with Confucianism. But also, as I've tried to point out here and there, I think there are a lot of other significant takeaways that are of great value, regardless of your theological beliefs. So I've tried to couch them in terms of, mental health, cognitive science that tends to coordinate with these notions. But I personally, honestly, have found some of the lessons I've learned from Daoism in particular to be the most useful when I'm trying to understand the world, right? So really hearkening back to this unity of opposites, right? If trying to understand the world in terms of pure evil and goodness that has not given me great insight. that dualistic way of thinking, to my mind, to the mind of the philosophers that we're studying, right? So even if we set aside your teacher's opinions about things, as you should, right? Even according to the Daoists, that dualistic thinking is what has caused so much of the disharmony and strife, right? We're under this illusion that things are opposite, and so at odds with one another, when really, right, things are more like the Tao, right, where everything has something about its opposite in it. And so that is one of the lessons that Zhuangzi is going to be elaborating on, right, really expanding our understanding of how there can be this unity within opposites and how that's supposed to help us gain knowledge of the world, right? Because again, there's a deep skepticism in Daoism because things are so complex and things are so interdependent, we can't just distinguish them as easily as dualistic thinking wants to make us believe. And so language is a challenge and can impart knowledge, right? So again, what do these metaphysical beliefs about the nature of reality say about what sort of knowledge is possible? Okay, so these two elements, the metaphysics and the epistemology, those are the elements that Zhuangzi is going to be elaborating on that we're going to finish up today. So any questions about Daoism or any review stuff that you want to cover before I dive back into the PowerPoint? I mean, they've done some really amazing studies on people who meditate too. There really is some incredible brainwave stuff happening in there. So picking up on, so we left off on Tuesday, sort of doing these overall comparisons between Lao Tzu, right, the founder of the Daoist tradition, the supposed author of the Tao Te Ching, and Zhuangzi, right, his most infamous disciple, and whose text is named after him. Again, I think one of the most interesting things to take away from these differences are their view on space and time, right? Specifically the infinity, right, or circularity of the nature of time. And then, of course, what it means in terms of how we should live our lives, right? So whether or not what we're focusing on, again, there's definitely more of an egalitarian approach here, right? Something that might be more useful for everyone, not just for those people who are in power. All right, so diving in now to this notion of knowledge, right? So I mentioned that there are going to be epistemological elements to Zhuangzi's philosophy that are significant. So what he's going to give us is this notion. So what we got from Lao Tzu, I should just review, was that notion of wu jin, or non-mind, right? So that is, again, doing things without thinking about the consequences, right? And this sort of thing, working with a state of mind that allows for wu wei, right? Non-action. But so again, the question for us is, how is Zhuangzi going to elaborate on that? So here he is really going to develop this epistemology of Wu Jin, or non-mind. And he's going to actually establish there are two types of knowledge, in fact, right? There's the conventional or ordinary type of knowledge that most people are talking about. And then there is the Daoist knowledge, right? That infinite sort of perspective where you can see everything from every point of view, right? So I tried to use these sort of graphics to delineate the difference of what Zhuangzi is talking about, right? So when you are operating under conventional knowledge, right, you may verbalize a proposition or believe a proposition and its truth value as being finite, right, and relative to a certain situation. Okay, so if I say something now about the current president of the United States, right, that proposition is only temporarily true, right, and the truth is relative to a lot of features, right, which country I'm talking about, which country I happen to be in when I say that, right? So what that's all going to determine with what I'm saying is true or not. But so that kind of stuff is not the knowledge that Daoists are after, right? We're not after conventional truths. We're not after truths that are only temporarily true, right? So this maybe brings us back to something you remember from Hinduism, right? The difference between Brahman and Maya, right? The ultimate reality and the illusion, right? The reason it's illusory, Maya, was because everything was only temporary. So there's an analog here to that sort of idea, right? That conventional knowledge, you can sort of see it equivalent to the type of knowledge Hindus thought was possible, right? The illusory knowledge in Maya, which is not really knowledge at all, right? So again, it just is temporarily true. It depends on a lot of different perspectives. And of course, it's going to result in all types of disagreements. Okay, so at best, this type of knowledge is only instrumentally valuable, right? So it's definitely not valuable in and of itself. And at best, it's sometimes useful, right? In terms of making our way through the world. But in terms of spiritual enlightenment, it's far too limited. Okay, so this type of knowledge, while it might temporarily be useful in the world, is not useful spiritually. Okay, that's the Daoist point of view is going to be the one we want. Okay, so at most, conventional knowledge, because it is perspectival, right? It depends upon context relative to a person and their standpoint. At most, it can touch on, again, manifestations of the Tao, right? So we can use conventional knowledge to say this person, right, this or that person, is doing something that is or is not in line with the Tao, right? And again, that statement is only going to be true temporarily or false temporarily. Okay, so this is all based on experience. But the goal of Daoism for Zhuangzi, if we're supposed to adopt non-mind, is to move away from trying to capture these types of truths. Now, of course, we have to exist in this world, so you shouldn't just reject all that knowledge, but this is not the kind of knowledge you should be actively seeking, okay? We should be trying the spiritual side of us if we're looking for enlightenment, right? If we're looking to solve the chaos and disharmony in the world, we should be attempting to seek a Tao point of view, right? One that is not dependent on a perspective, one that is central and sees all possibilities at once, right? So it's not like you're standing here and looking this direction. It's as if you had eyes all around, 180 degrees, 360, all the way around. So from all perspectives, it's not necessarily seen as objective because it's not outside, right? It's not external to the thing it is observing. It is part of itself, right? So there too, we're seeing a really important lack of distinction between the observer and the things being observed, which is also, again, language that we saw a lot in Hinduism, right? When you're supposed to understand your Atman in relationship to Brahman, right? You are not supposed to see it as a distinct, right? Your Atman is not distinct or individualistic. Okay, so there too, the idea is to recognize yourself as one with everything. And this is going to be the element that I think allows for the Neo-Confucian movement to develop such a rich metaphysics for bringing Buddhism in, right? They're able to bring in this notion of seeing everything, but also there's an emptiness to it in the sense that you are not an individual observing that thing, right? You are part of it. You disappear into the thing you are observing, right? So it's a very rich notion of infinite perspective, right? Really, really being able to see everything. So the idea is that if you are able to attain this point of view and truly see from all perspectives, then you obviously your perspective goes beyond disagreement, because you can see that the disagreements are just coming from different perspectives colliding into each other and not seeing the bigger picture. When you are in this Tao point of view, you're also ready for any change or transformation, because you're not trying to hold on to one specific truth and fight it off against, convailing forces. The idea here is that you're ready to see all things that can be true at once. So this is going to then require, obviously, a different way of living, right? So someone who has the Taoist point of view, lives in accordance with the Tao, is going to embody a certain way of being. And this notion of selfhood that one should aim to embody, as Zhen is authentic selfhood. Okay, so this requires leaving ordinary life behind and identifying with the infinity of nature, right? So truly, again, almost adopting an empty ego, much like what we saw in Buddhism, right? Again, of course, this is very difficult, if not impossible to achieve, but the goal is that it's what we should be aiming towards, right? So again, perhaps a bit of a virtue ethic there. It might not be attainable, but we should always be striving for it. Okay, so we shouldn't just be changing our perspective. We're really just trying to attain a universal perspective. So it's not just moving from over here to over here to over here, although that might be a starting point, right? But eventually we need to learn to step in the middle and see all these points of view at once. Okay, I'm going to stop there because that's kind of heavy. So questions about that, the differences between conventional knowledge and what Zhuangzi means by a Taoist point of view. Yes, good. So because the Tao is infinite, right? There is a question of whether or not a human mind, right, which we normally perceive as finite, could ever conceive of an infinite thing. And under the conventional type of knowledge, we can't understand the Tao in its entirety, right? Because it's a finite perspective. So we couldn't understand the infinite Tao from a finite perspective. At most, we can understand an instance of the Tao, right, that happens to fit with that finite observation. Whereas if we take a universal perspective of the Tao, then it makes it possible, right, to understand the Tao in its entirety, because you're not confining yourself to one part of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you for that.
Awesome. Great. Question. Other questions? So then continuing on, we're going to look at now some of Zhuangzi's elaborate arguments against ordinary knowledge. So now really putting it down, this conventional knowledge, which, philosophers love to do. They got to, right? We have these options. Now we're going to talk about the issues with the things that most people emphasize, right? So most people emphasize ordinary knowledge. That's what most people seek. And they seek it for its instrumental value, right? We talked about this at the beginning of the quarter when we talked about why it might be important to even ask philosophical questions, right? What are the ends of life? What are our goals? Are you just trying to get a job, to make more money, right? To do the thing, to buy the house, right? Or are we trying to live a particular way, be a particular person, right? Engage in the world, to bring about a particular end result, right? What are these motives? And so he's going to give us here now some arguments against that ordinary knowledge to try to get us to not value it as much as society has told us to value it, right? Because remember, Daoism is very much getting back to our spontaneous intuitions. Okay, so 4 arguments here. The first one is the argument from relativity of distinctions. Okay, so the idea is that anytime we make a distinction between two things, right, that one of those two things is always relative to the other one, right? So all judgments that we make, all judgments regarding distinctions, so any distinction between two things is a judgment, according to Zhuangzi. And all of these judgments are subjective or relative, right? So good is not good unless it's relative to something bad. Bad is not bad unless it's relative to something good, right? And this goes for even non-moral judgments, right? Something being big tall, right? Valuable, not valuable, right? All of these things are relative to something else. They're only true relative to something else. So they do not and cannot represent the Tao point of view, right? Because they are finite from a single perspective. Okay, the second one is the argument from complementariness of opposites, right? So this is where he goes on to say, not only are distinctions relative to one another, right? Good, bad, light, dark, blah, 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 right? The idea is that they actually complement one another, meaning that any concept, especially concept involving a distinction, any concept logically implies its negation. And he has a really funny example for this. And it's not the horse example in the stories that comes later. It's another horse example. But if I asked all of you to think of a horse, how would you describe it to me? Someone describe a horse to me. Okay, that's very vague though, right? That doesn't just denote horses, that denotes all kinds of things. So what makes a horse as opposed to something else? So then I'm going to show you a picture of a donkey and an antelope, and I'm going to say, look at these horses. They meet all of your criteria, right? So what Lao Tzu's point is going to be, or Zhuangzi's point is going to be, is that any concept you have of a thing is going to have to involve some concept of what that thing is not, right? So yes, it is these things, but it's also not these other things. And so in order to make that distinction, we have to start nitpicking, right? None of that is what you think of when you think of a horse. Now you just have to find it in order to maintain this distinction, right? And so in this sense, yeah, so it's a really fascinating idea that in order to have a concept of something, we have to have an understanding of its opposite, which means that they aren't in fact opposites, right? That they in fact complement each other. Yeah, good. I love the horse example. Okay, so there are just different ways one could think of looking at the same thing. And so neither then is fundamental to its nature, right? We're just picking based on the instrumental value of whatever gets the other person to agree with us, right? If it's, I guess you could sort of think it's like those games of like charades or something. And there's always like some movie scene or TV scene where like, you expect the people to do really, really badly, but they end up winning because they have all these inside jokes, right? So when they make a particular reference, the other person just happens to know what they're referencing because they were there. But anyone on the outside has no clue what they're talking about, right? It's the same sort of idea, is that it's just a purpose. These language, these words, the way we're articulating them, the way we're trying to convey them, the image we're trying to make, we're just using them as tools to achieve some end, right? In this case, the end was getting you to think of the thing that I'm thinking of, right? But again, it's not really because any of the words I'm using are true to the nature of the thing. I'm just using them as tools to get you to the same mindset where you can think of it. But that could be anything, right? It could have nothing to do with what the thing actually is. Yeah, good. Okay. So continuing on then, the third one is the argument from perspectives, right? No perceiver can access the perceptions of another, right? Even really of our own perceptions at another time. At best, we only have memories, right? So this is saying like, I can never really access what it's like to perceive the world from someone else's point of view, right? And so at best, I can try to, listen or read or understand, through some sort of sympathetic understanding or empathy. But even when it comes to my own memories, right, the point is that I'm not really re-experiencing them the way I experienced them in the first place, right? I'm experiencing my memory of those things. And if you know anything about how fallible human memory is, right, you'll know that our perceptions are affected a lot, right, by our state of mind. And so if that's the case, if all of these individual perceptions, and again, the perceptions he's talking about here are these ones, right? One's coming from over here, maybe another person's coming from over here, right? We're arguing about things, arguing from different perspectives. The point is that we shouldn't be trying to determine which perception is the correct one. Now, again, this is maybe something really useful to right now, the state of disarray and disagreement that the world is in, let alone our country, right? But the idea that instead of trying to get people to agree with you, right? Maybe try a different approach, right? Instead of trying to say you're right and I'm wrong, or I'm right and you're wrong, right? The idea is that attaining a different perspective might not be about focusing on which one is right and which one is wrong, right? So that argument is, again, probably more about language and about other things than it is about actually getting to the truth, right? So this is, again, perhaps a useful tool one might try to employ in navigating disharmony and chaos, right? You can real world example to see if Daoism works, right? The fourth argument here is the argument from skepticism, right? That because of this, okay, the objective truth can never be known, right? Since it would require an independent standard by which to judge it. And there is no such standard because we are all part of the Tao, right? So again, this is denying the ability. So there's a bit of a metaphysical claim here that the observer cannot be outside of the Tao to observe it. And that's the only thing that would count as objective truth, right? Something that is outside observing in. But since there's no such thing, right, we shouldn't just be trying to, maybe we can't be seeking on standards of agreement, right? So maybe, again, we shouldn't be trying to focus on who's right, who's wrong, getting people to agree. Maybe there are other ways of approaching this. Okay, so those are the four arguments that Zhuangzi gives against ordinary knowledge. And from this, I mentioned that Zhuangzi expands Lao Tzu's three basic teachings of Wu Zhi, Wu Wei, and Wu Jin, okay, return to nothingness, non-action, and non-mind, into 7 different teachings, right? So he's taking those 3 teachings and expanding them into these 7. So the first one, right, now we have a better understanding of because we've delineated the difference between conventional knowledge and a Daoist perspective. So here he wants to discredit the notion of big picture knowledge, right? The idea that people can somehow stand in all these perspectives at once and see everything from every angle. Again, he does not think that that is possible. There is no such point of view. So instead, we should focus on attaining some small knowledge or manifestations of the way. That's the best we can do, right? Is we can try to identify the things that we experience, but we shouldn't be arguing with the people who are observing things from over here, right? At best, we can try to attain this, but again, we're not even sure if it's possible. We're not even sure if it's possible. So focusing on the attaining of small knowledge of the way, so very intellectual humility here, right? We can try our best to understand by examples of people living in accordance with the way. So we should discredit debate because it's rarely about truth. It's really about who people want to think is right. And so there's a lot more rhetoric and psychological manipulation going on in terms of debate than actual truth seeking. Then fourth, of course, as we've already talked about, the idea that opposites are identical, right? That they in fact involve their opposites, right? So any concept necessarily involves its opposite, meaning that they are not so distinct. 5, all things are in a process of transformation. So this is just a continuation of the teaching of the Tao as constantly changing. He is going to combine non-action and non-mind because they are so interrelated, right? You have to be in a state of non-mind to achieve non-action. So he combines them and calls it non-striving. And then finally says that we should only aim to achieve complete freedom from unnatural constraints, right? So this is even a different, again, the end goal, the idea is that this is what will allow for social harmony. But it's almost like the harmony comes as a byproduct of this. This is what we should be aiming for. If you're just trying to achieve harmony directly, that might lead to, again, I'm right, you're wrong, blah, 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 and all these problems. But if we're just trying to free ourselves, if we're just trying to address the cause, right, of the distress, then those unnecessary byproducts can hopefully be avoided. All right, so with that, there were 4 readings that I asked you to look at. And again, don't worry, it's fine if you didn't. I'm gonna go over them really quickly. But each of them is a parable to demonstrate certain lessons, one or more of these 7 lessons. Okay, so the first one is the tale of the butcher. In this story, I might have actually mentioned the butcher one already. right, if you use, it's about how many times you have to sharpen your knife. Did I mention that one already? So I think I mentioned it, yeah, when I was originally describing Wu Wei, right, the idea of non-action. So this is the idea that there are, four different, or a number of different butchers, and a butcher who is, brand new and is like, really worried and overthinking everything, probably has to sharpen their knife every day, right? Because they're hacking and hitting bones and tendons and da 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 da, right? They're so in their head about what they're doing that they're not able to just be present in the moment and work with the nature of the meat, right? Such that their blade doesn't get chipped. And so the idea is that as you look at butchers who are closer to the Tao, right, more in line with the Tao, the less often they have to sharpen their knives. Exactly, yes. So a butcher who is in line with the Tao never needs to sharpen their knife because they know every single, minutia. I don't know what you call all the different pieces of meat, but right, in the flesh, right? But they know it's so, and they're just able to go with the flow and right, follow it such that they're never chipping their knife against anything, right? So that, yeah, that's very much the purpose of the tale of the butcher. Okay, the second one is the tale of the dying man. Here too, again, I think I've referenced this parable already. The idea that if we're supposed to accept the Tao as things constantly transforming and changing, then that includes aspects of our physical health, right? So there is a man who is, I think in this story, he's got like a crippling sort of degenerative disease, and his friends want him to seek some sort of medical attention, at least for the pain, right? But the idea in the mind of the dying man is that to seek that medical attention would actually be trying to intervene in nature, right? That this is a natural process, what's happening to his body, right? And so intervening in it would be fighting nature and not being in line with the Tao. So this one I think is really fascinating because the closest sort of modern day analog I can think of is maybe, people who forego like cancer treatments or medical treatments because they'd rather live out whatever time they have left doing what they want and not spending it, in a hospital, hooked up to a machine, feeling gross, right? Or something like this. So, it's interesting to think about what role even trying to maintain our health has in aligning or not aligning with nature, right? So surely there are certain natural aspects of athleticism that are important, but also, yeah, disease, death, decay is part of nature too. So should we be fighting that? Another contemporary analog, I think, is the fact that, we are prolonging human life a lot more now. And we have noticed a result is that certain cognitive decline, like dementia, certain types of cognitive decline, I should say, are becoming more and more prominent, which is leading scientists to suggest that our brain hasn't evolved to live as long as our bodies are now being able to survive. So, right, again, are we pushing nature beyond what it's able to do or what it should be doing, if there's a should, right? So yeah, there's a question there, I think, definitely potentially worth reflecting on. All right, the third one is the tale of the horses. That one's actually my favorite, so I'm gonna save that one for last. The tale of the monkeys. I talked to you about monkeys before when we talked about Buddhism. This is a different monkey story. So this monkey parable involves a scientist or someone who's working with monkeys, and he is promising the monkeys, I think it's like 3 cookies in the morning and 2 cookies in the afternoon. But it's the afternoon, and so they really want 3 cookies. And so he says, fine, I'll give you 2 cookies in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. And the monkeys are really happy. And this is another example of how opposites aren't the same. Right? Like, you think it's different, but I just swapped it. It's exactly the same. So yeah, my favorite story is the third one, the tale of the horses. And this is a combination of a couple of different lessons. Primarily the first one, discrediting big picture knowledge, and the 7th one, that we should only aim to achieve complete freedom from unnatural constraints. And this story goes that there is a town that gives this one individual a lot of praise. He's like the horse whisperer of the town, right? And so the question is, how much knowledge does this person actually have of horses? And the point of the parable, I encourage you to read it. The point of the parable demonstrates that all this man really has knowledge of are what horses are like in captivity, right? When they're, restricted and restrained and motivated by punishment and reward. He does not really understand the nature of horses, right? And so this leads into the second one, right? The idea is that to truly understand horses, you should understand them in their free environment out in nature, right? But by that very fact, right, you wouldn't be able to know them as well because they would be out being free. Treated them horribly, right? And this is true of a lot of people who maintain animals. And if you're training animals, that involves a lot of really unethical activity. So those horses that prance, does anyone know how they get horses to do that? It's worse than starving them, I think. They pour acid on their hooves to get them to, yeah. So again, when you look at people who are, another great example of this, I'm sure you saw the Tiger King thing. There's another documentary about the chimp lady. And she in her mind, it's an excellent documentary, but she in her mind, you can tell she really thinks she loves these animals, right? And she really thinks they love her back. But you can tell that she's, despite her care and her seemingly good intention for them, she's not acting in the best interest of the animals. And the animals' interactions with her really are more like the way prisoners treat their, the people who feed them. And it's more like Stockholm syndrome than that these animals really love you. So it's important to think about, the kinds of knowledge people claim to have, especially even in this case, scientific knowledge, right? A lot of zoos will put up false information about the animals in their habitats because the lifespan of animals in captivity is so much shorter. So they will lie about the lifespan of those animals in the wild to make it seem like they live longer in captivity. So again, question everyone who claims to know the truth about something, right? Question everything. So that sort of skepticism, again, is being even more heavily laid out here. All right. So on that last slide there, I go over just the different, I correlate each of the stories to each of the different teachings. So I encourage you to go back through and read them and see if you can pick it out. But think about, again, how if you think these are important lessons, how might they manifest in life today? So, but otherwise, have a good weekend. Maxwell, go take a nap.